Did I really finally just sign up for Disney Plus just so I could watch Artemis Fowl? Yes. Yes, I did. Darn it. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about Disney's 2020 Disney Plus released fantasy adventure film, Artemis Fowl. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All of my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Artemis Fowl stars Ferdia, Chau, Lara, McDonnell, and Josh Gad, and was directed by Kenneth Branagh. Very loosely based on Owen Colfer's 2001 novel of the same name, it tells the story of 12-year-old criminal mastermind Artemis Fowl, played by Ferdia, Chau, as he kidnaps a ferry police officer in order to use the ransom to save his father's life. This movie is baffling to me. I know I'm tipping my hand really early in this review, but this is not a good movie. And that's so disappointing to me. Because I want to be clear, I really wanted to like this movie. I didn't watch it just to crap on it and make a quick snarky review about it. I legitimately wanted to see it, and I wasn't joking in the intro. I really did finally just sign up for Disney Plus. I've been considering it since November, and I don't use streaming platforms enough to really justify it, but Artemis Fowl gave me that final push I needed to finally sign up. And so, yeah, this is a bad movie. And I know most people are putting together pretty short reviews of it, but I actually have a lot of thoughts on it, and I really want to talk about it and why it doesn't work. I want to offer you some insight into this coming from a fan of the books, but not just make it a book-movie comparison, because I know a lot of people have never heard of Artemis Fowl before now and are just curious about the movie. So I'm going to limit my comparisons to things that truly impact the film, and also explain them and give you some context just in case you've never read the books. Speaking of context, I think I should probably tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from with regard to this franchise. I'm somebody who read these books and really enjoyed them when I was a kid. The first book came out when I was 11 years old, and so I was really in the target age bracket for the first 3 books, and I reread them a lot in that time period. And I really enjoyed the later books too, even though I didn't read them until I was in college. But I have to tell you, I haven't reread the first 3 books in about 16 years, but they've really stuck with me a lot more than I realized they had. Ever since those first few books, I've wanted an Artemis Fowl movie. And 19 years later, we have this. And I hesitate to even call this an adaptation of the book. There is so little here that's truly drawn from the source material. The plot, the characters, their motivations, the themes, everything is incredibly different, really making this Artemis Fowl in name alone. And if you've seen any other reviews, I'm sure you've heard something similarly dramatic, but I can assure you it's not hyperbole. This movie is so different from the books that it's almost unrecognizable. And I know how that sounds. I can hear you right now saying, the movie's always different from the book, what do you expect? And you're right, books always get changed a bit when they're adapted. Scenes and minor characters get cut, ideas get condensed and combined, maybe a new sequence gets added, but the core of the story usually remains pretty consistent, and that's just not the case here. I'm not talking about little nitpick details. There are several central elements of the book that are so fundamentally changed in this movie that it becomes something entirely different. And those changes are major contributing factors as to why this movie doesn't work, even to non-fans of Artemis Fowl who are just viewing this as a standalone movie. So let's talk about some of these major changes and what they did to the resulting film. I guess we should probably start most broadly with the general plot and setup for the story. So when it comes to book adaptations, again, we're accustomed to some changes. It's really hard to adapt a book. You've got to take hundreds of pages of detail and nuance and distill it down enough to cram it into a 2-hour movie. And so that's part of why movies setting up potential franchises are usually on the longer side, because they need to not only tell a story, but also establish the world and main characters. And the desire to provide as much detail as possible in the movie has also led to a bit of a trend in adaptations of young adult book series. Think about Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, Twilight. What do they all have in common? Each of those series have more movies than books, because one of the books was split into 2 movies. Now, there's obviously some box office monetary incentive for that, but it also allows for more detail and better pacing too. Artemis Fowl takes the complete opposite approach instead. First off, it's barely over 90 minutes long, which is crazy when you think about the fact that this is intended to be the introductory film of a fantasy franchise. Again, for a movie like this, you need to be able to tell the story, but also world build, so a 95-minute runtime would be a tough enough obstacle on its own. But inexplicably, this movie crams together story elements from the first two books. And not only that, but it also adds an unnecessary MacGuffin and additional plot points that were invented purely for the movie. So we end up with essentially 3 stories worth of material jammed into only an hour and a half. And as you could probably imagine, it doesn't work. It was such a strange decision that, on the surface, doesn't make any sense. But I do have a theory about why they did it, which I'll tell you a little later when I'm talking about a specific character. The next impactful fundamental change I want to talk about is with the character of Artemis Fowl. With the exception of his name and maybe his hair, the movie version of Artemis bears no resemblance to the book version. And I'm not just talking physical appearance here. His personality and really what makes him who he is has been completely altered in such a way that it legitimately changes the central core of the film, and the franchise as a whole, in the extremely unlikely event that we get a sequel. So, for those who haven't read the books, let me give you a really brief description of his character and background. He's a 12-year-old genius criminal mastermind, and even though he's really young, he never acts like a kid. At the start of the first book, his criminal father has been missing and presumed dead for several years, and his mother's gone insane as a result. Artemis is well aware of his family's criminal history and has been carrying on the family business, so to speak, in his father's absence. He's described as an extremely pale, vampire-looking character who has an aversion to any physical activity and hates being outside for very long. So, when this film introduces us to Artemis for the first time by showing him surfing, I knew we were in trouble. And that might seem like an insignificant thing, and for the plot, it is. But for the character, it's not. In this movie, he's really established as a kid. They tell us he's smart, but you definitely don't get the sense that he's a genius. He's also completely unaware that his father's a criminal. And so this really changes the whole dynamic of the story. Because in the first book, Artemis is the villain. He's the bad guy who kidnaps a fairy and holds her for ransom purely for monetary gain. He's sort of the co-main character, and you like him, but you're not really rooting for him. And just like about every other young adult novel series, this is a coming-of-age story. He starts off as a selfish villain, but grows and develops over an 8-book character arc, which is like the whole point of the series. The movie destroys that, effectively nullifying the franchise from the start. For whatever reason, the filmmakers didn't want to portray Artemis as the villain of this story. Instead, they do everything in their power to make him a sympathetic character. He's just an outcast kid whose mother died and father's always away on business. He loves reading books about fairy tales and magical creatures, and has no idea of his family's centuries-long criminal history. His actions over the course of the movie aren't selfish, but rather selfless in order to save his father. And so this brings me to that theory I mentioned earlier regarding the reason for randomly jamming the second book into this first movie. It's all part of an effort to establish Artemis as the hero of the story. Without having him as the villain, the first book doesn't really have an antagonist, and they needed a bad guy in this movie, so they decided to pull in the main villain from the second book, Opal Cowboy. Again, it's really a name alone though, and her scheme isn't anything like the book. So that allows Artemis to be the hero, but he's still not sympathetic enough. So they take the most basic premise of the father rescue plotline from the second book and use that to justify and explain what Artemis does in this movie, rather than just accepting that he's supposed to be a criminal. And by taking away that whole part of Artemis's being, we're left with a very generic character who fails to be compelling in any way. Unfortunately, Artemis isn't the only character whose core is so substantially changed that it has a major impact on the movie. Holly Short also receives an equally mystifying character makeover. So again, for the non-book people, here's the basic rundown on Holly. She's an elf who lives in the lower elements, which is an underground world where an assortment of magical beings, collectively known as fairies, exist away from humans. She's a young adult by elf standards and is the first and only female officer in the Lep Recon, which is the lower elements police reconnaissance division. As such, she gets hassled and faces a lot of sexism in the workplace, and so she's a very determined and strong character who's constantly trying to prove herself. She's also extremely distrustful of all humans, bordering on the edge of hatred, because her mother died as a result of humans. In the movie, Holly is basically stripped of all of her identifying personality and physical characteristics. She's still a Lep Recon officer, but there's nothing that sets her apart from the hundreds of other officers except maybe her youth and eagerness. She's no longer the only female officer, and in fact, the commander of the Lep Recon has been gender swapped here, which negates a big thematic piece of the story and removes many of the obstacles Holly faces in the book. They also remove her mother from her background and instead insert a created for the movie subplot involving her father being a traitor. Like Artemis, Holly's supposed to be a flawed character at the beginning. She's never the villain, but her hatred of humans clouds her judgment, and so she too has a significant character arc over the 8 books. But that animosity towards humans is basically dropped here. We see her saving random humans, and her interactions with Artemis are actually mostly positive here. There's a little friction between them when they first meet, but because of their dual invented father plot lines, they pretty much bond out of nowhere and are friendly with each other. And that's just not the case with the book series, where their relationship takes multiple books to get to a positive place. So rushing that by removing her biggest character flaw completely changes the dynamic of their relationship, making it far less complex and, once again, very generic and unmemorable. Now, there are countless other character changes made in this movie. I already mentioned the gender swap of Commander Root, but really everybody's altered in some major way. Mulch Diggums, Opal, Foley the Centaur, Juliet, and probably most strangely and questionably, Butler. And I'd love to discuss all those changes and more with anybody who wants to talk about them, but for this review, I'm not going to really go into them because I don't think they were impactful enough changes to be contributing factors to this film's failure. What was a big contributing factor, though, was the script. I don't think I've seen a movie that was this messy in a really long time. It manages to feel both incredibly rushed and unfinished at the same time. This movie has been in various stages of development for nearly 2 decades. It's gone through countless writers and scripts and directors and actors over the years, and so hundreds of people have had their hands on it, and it really shows. Because this is a clunky, incohesive mishmash of ideas that are cobbled together in a way that's confusing to follow even with the context of having read the books. The movie lacks flow, often abruptly jumping between scenes in a way that seems to be indicative of significant cutting in the editing room. That idea is only further supported by the frequent narration and off-camera dialogue, which also both feel like hastily inserted elements to patch gaps left in the story. Of course, a script doesn't just provide us with a film's plot and structure. We also have to talk about the dialogue, which is another noticeably weak component of this movie. None of it feels like natural conversation. It's all so stiff and sounds like something that somebody would write, but not what somebody would actually say. Some of that's certainly due to the performances and line delivery, which I'll touch on in a second, but a big part of it boils down to the context of the dialogue. Exposition. So much exposition. I know a lot of people who are bothered by pretty much any amount of exposition, but for me, I really don't mind a little of it. So I'm typically much more lenient and forgiving of movies for using exposition. But holy crap, is there so much in this movie. Like, an unfathomable amount. Nothing is implied or shown to us. Probably because 3 stories are jammed into 95 minutes. Instead, every piece of character history, world building, and premise is explicitly verbalized. A lot of it comes in the form of a lazy interrogation-style narration of the story, but much is present in the actual dialogue too. characters are constantly awkwardly saying things just to give the audience a piece of information. And it comes from everyone. Artemis, Holly, Commander Root, Mulch, Foley, Butler, Artemis's father. I would say that conservatively, 55% of the dialogue in this film is pure exposition. So, as you might expect, that results in some incredibly stilted, awkward acting. Even the best performances are severely hampered by the script and terrible dialogue. Now, I always feel a bit bad criticizing child actors, especially when their adult co-stars are also giving unsatisfying performances, but Ferdia Chau gives a very unconvincing performance here. This is his first screen credit, so you can't judge too harshly, but he just doesn't have the skill or charisma yet to lead a film like this. But even the more experienced actors either phone it in or give very odd, rough performances. I would say that the only performances that didn't negatively stand out were Colin Farrell as Artemis Fowl Sr. and Lara McDonnell as Holly Short. But Farrell's role was barely in the movie, and neither of them gave fantastic performances. So I'll reiterate, Artemis Fowl is not a good movie. The filmmaking aspects are poor, the script is an atrocious excuse for an adaptation, and it came out 15 years too late. The development hell limbo that this movie was stuck in obliterated any chances it had, which is so frustrating and disappointing, because this could have been good. An Artemis Fowl movie, done right, could have been awesome and could have spawned a movie franchise where we would have had a chance to see those complex, mature themes and character arcs play out. Instead, we have this movie. We're not going to be getting a sequel, and frankly, I don't want to see a sequel for this movie. And unfortunately, I think the chances of a reboot of Artemis Fowl somewhere down the line are slim to none. And so, fans of the books have been robbed of the movie potential they've waited decades for, and newcomers to the series are left with this being their first and possibly only Artemis Fowl experience. And so the only thing I can say is darv it. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. On the pro side, there's really not much. I guess there's a handful of minor positive things. I thought Lara McDonnell was okay as Holly. She didn't look like what the character's supposed to, and she couldn't do anything about the bad writing, but I thought she did pretty well with what she was given, especially considering her age and relative acting inexperience. I also thought some of the visual effects were pretty decent. Certainly not all of them, and this resembled a Sci-Fi Channel movie at times, but there were a few flight scenes that looked okay, and some elements of the time freezes were good too. And I guess this movie does sorta have a second pro that's personal for me and maybe some other people, and that's the nostalgia factor. It's a bad movie and is nothing like the books, but you know what? It's made me think about the books more in the last few days than I have in the last decade, and it's reminded me just how much I love them. So, in a weird way, the movie's awfulness has made me want to reread the series just to have some good Artemis Fowl. So, it's technically not a pro of the movie, but it's a positive outcome for me, so I'm counting it. On the con side is everything else. By far, the biggest issue here is how poor of an adaptation it is. Very little of what made the book what it was shows up here. The changes made to the plot, the characters, the themes are all so substantial that they fundamentally change the story. This is Artemis Fowl in name alone, and it's massively disappointing to see a book so interestingly crafted and surprisingly thematically mature get reduced to generic drivel just because Disney didn't want the main character to be a villain. The second con has got to be the exposition. It's absolutely absurd how much of it there is. And like I said before, I'm usually very forgiving when it comes to exposition. I like knowing as much as I can about a story, so a little decently inserted exposition is not a bad thing to me. But the sheer amount of exposition here is utterly baffling, and it's horribly integrated into the story. They don't even really try to blend it in a natural way. It's just dumped on us through Mulch's terrible narration or awkwardly delivered as dialogue between the characters. Con number 3 expands upon the last one and is more broadly the script. All of the exposition contributes to this, but even the non-exposition dialogue is awkward and incredibly unnatural sounding. And then you've got the film's structure and randomly invented plot points that are nowhere to be found in the source material. It's this confusing, clunky script that was clearly cobbled together from bits and pieces of material written by many screenwriters over the last 20 years. It feels inconsistent, incomplete, and ultimately unsatisfying. The fourth major con has to be the performances. With the horrible plot adaptation and atrocious script, it's really no surprise that the acting in this movie is rough. At best, these actors scrape by doing what they could to elevate the material they were given to mediocrity. At worst, they deliver floundering, stilted performances that fail to either capture the essence of the character they're portraying or get you remotely interested in the character. Nobody's good here. A few are okay, but most are awkwardly awful. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Artemis Fowl 1 out of 5 paws. It pains me to say that, but it's so bad. I think maybe if I had watched this movie as a standalone thing and wasn't aware of the source material, I might have given it a 1.5, but it's not good. I cannot believe that this was actually supposed to get a theatrical release this year. I would recommend Artemis Fowl to nobody. Even with movies I don't like, I always try to think of who might enjoy the film, but there's really not anything redeemable here. It fails as an adaptation, and it fails as a standalone movie. If you're a fan of the books, you're gonna be incredibly disappointed by this movie. With all the massive changes, it's almost unrecognizable as Artemis Fowl. And if you've never read the books, you're gonna be beyond confused and extremely bored by this painfully generic movie. And regardless of your previous experience with Artemis Fowl, you're going to be left frustrated and let down by this film. If you liked Artemis Fowl, I'm confused, but happy for you. And I'd recommend that you check out Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. It's the first Harry Potter movie, released the same year as the first Artemis Fowl book, and is a good example of an introductory fantasy book adaptation film done right. If you want another recent Disney live-action book adaptation, you might want to watch A Wrinkle in Time. That one's also got some fantasy elements and periodically iffy visuals. And if you want yet another young adult fantasy novel adaptation franchise non-starter, I'd suggest that you watch The Golden Compass. It's based on the first book of the thematically dense His Dark Materials trilogy, and has also been criticized for being a fairly poor adaptation of the source material, which strips away or dilutes many of the book's defining themes. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Artemis Fowl? If so, what'd you think of it? I'm especially curious to know if you've read the books too, or if you're a newcomer to the story. And number 2, what was your most disappointing, long-awaited movie? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.